Okay, let's look at the next segment then, which has to do with social emotional skills. So you might remember when we briefly talked about Phineas Gage, we were reminded of how much trouble he had with social context. He was described, and I love John Fleischman's book because he so eloquently describes Phineas as in such detail. You can practically see him as you read the book in front of you. But he just couldn't get along with people. It wasn't just that he was out of control and used vulgar language of the mid-1800s, but that he didn't even notice that he was being rude or offensive to other people. And he would fly off the handle, and people just didn't want to be around him, and they actually said, he's not Phineas anymore. He's somebody else. And I love the way Nick Goldberg reminds us how the emphasis really on executive function in the frontal lobes has been more on cognition than social emotional, and how critically important it is that we tie these two together. And that's why I tie them together in this presentation. I think it's so very important that we measure all of these aspects to do a good assessment of executive function. That's the goal, right? That's the point here as we move through. And I think merging cognition and emotional is critically important for every practitioner, because you're not going to just, it's not a good idea just to give a rating scale and then decide that a person has EF problem or not. You really have to look well beyond that. I would also encourage people to take a look at Steve Feifer's books on emotional disorders, where he really nicely ties together social emotional and executive function. And to bring out the importance of social emotional, I actually want to show a dissertation that was recently done. I was on the committee for a student, her name is Tiffany Kong, and she did something quite remarkable in her study. She wanted to look at the extent to which social emotional skills, what we talk about when we talk about frontal lobes, actually relate to achievement. I think, my argument is that social emotional skills is just a reflection of the frontal lobes. It's an expression of frontal lobes. It's an expression of this concept we call executive function. And the study that she used had 275-ish of students. All the students had been identified as gifted based upon a verbal, quantitative, nonverbal test. So that's very traditional IQ. The COGAT instrument that they use to measure verbal, quantitative, and nonverbal is really just a group administered Wechsler. It comes from the same literature, the Army Alpha and the Army Beta, just like the Otis Lennon did. Otis was one of the people who worked on the Alpha and Beta, like a lot of other people developed these tools. Anyway, so there's no EF in the COGAT or the Wechsler. And so I was really intrigued by this study because I thought the DESSA, which is the social emotional scale, was really an EF within a social context. And I thought it would be very strongly correlated with achievement. So the DESSA is a 72-item rating scale, social emotional skills. And this DESSA is built on basically on the Castle framework for what those social emotional skills should be. So we had the COGAT, which is traditional IQ, the DESSA was social emotional, and the SAT, a norm-referenced achievement test. When we looked at just the basic descriptives for the students, on the verbal, the quantitative, and the nonverbal, all the standard scores, mean of 100 and SD of 16, were all in the 120 to 125 range. Their overall COGAT score was 126 or so. The scores on the DESSA and the scores on the achievement were considerably lower. They were about 110. But the really interesting part of this was that when we looked at the predictions of achievement, what we found was that the DESSA not only correlated higher with achievement than the COGAT, but in a hierarchical regression, we found that the COGAT did not even enter into the prediction equation, and that all you really needed was the DESSA to predict achievement. That speaks to the power of executive function, in this case expressed as social emotional skills. And if you want to have more information about interventions related to those social emotional skills, you can go to these two sites, the Devereux and Apperson sites. And there's considerable information about interventions. So now we're on target for a few more questions.
Okay, so related to the section that you were just speaking to, how do you view the relationship between executive functioning and resilience?
Okay, that's a wonderful question. And of course, resilience is an outcome. We are resilient because of what are called social emotional skills, or sometimes called protective factors. But basically that just means the kinds of things that we measure with the DESSA or other measures, or the kinds of things that the folks at Castle talk about. And so when we talk about resilience, what we're really talking about is the effect of the frontal lobes of executive function on performance of people. That outcome it's not just by chance that we're good, we're resilient or not. And I really encourage people to look more in the literature. Let me back up for a second. I really encourage people, researchers, to look more closely at the relationship between executive function, these protective factors, and who becomes resilient and who doesn't. And I think you're going to find it's going to be very much predicted by the measure of frontal lobe function and executive function. All right, so when we say that social emotional skills are a result of EF and what the person has learned, and I think it's really important to just be clear that we learn social emotional skills, but it's an interaction of who we are as people from a neuropsychological perspective and what our environment teaches us. Okay, so now next I want to spend a little bit of time talking about executive function and academic and job performance. I've been writing about this connection between basic psychological processes and academic performance for a really long time, and I've been very happy to see some new kinds of measures of achievement that have been recently published. And the closer we can get these two together, the better decisions we can make about the extent to which a child's reading problem is related to executive function problem. And I'll just use this as an example. This happens to be a reading comprehension test that's part of a test called a Feifer assessment of reading. And when we put together a measure of executive function and then we look at its possible impact on academics, in this particular kind of a subtest, we can get at the extent to which a student is using a strategy when they're doing reading comprehension, which of course is a good thing to do in the first place when you're doing reading comprehension. But this particular instrument allows us to look at that more directly. And the same thing with Steve Feifer's measurement of math, where I really like this approach because it's not so much about can you do the mathematics, but can you figure out how you have to do what you want to do? And that's what EF is all about. That's what I've been talking about all this time. is EF is about figuring out how you're going to do what it is you need to do. EF is so strongly related not just to academics in elementary school, obviously highly related to academics in all of school and in all of life, academic and jobs for sure. So anyway, I really like this approach to understanding performance, and how it all fits together then is when we start to look at a cognitive weakness in executive function, especially if you have a disorder in one or more basic psychological processes, which was we talked about earlier, EF on a test like the CAS or some other test. When we have this connectivity to a specific academic skill, like silent read fluency or word recall, and we connect these two in this triangle that I talked about, so where we would have a poor EF score, poor reading comprehension, and yet we have good scores in areas that are not EF. So in a case like this, good simultaneous and successive scores, poor executive function score, poor CEFI score, poor observations in the classroom, seeing the student as impulsive and disorganized and so on and so forth. And we see poor reading comprehension. Of course, we would likely see poor math, specific kinds of math as well, especially math computation, math calculation. Then we start to see that we have a student with an executive function learning disability. We don't usually think about a learning disability from an executive function perspective, but we should, because executive function is a disorder in one or more basic psychological processes. And of course, this has implications for what happens in special ed, because that means teachers need to understand what executive function is and how to encourage it, not to directly teach it. In other words, not to be the frontal lobes of the students, which of course happens too often. And we have suggestions in the various chapters and books that Steve and I have written about what would happen next. So now we have time for another question.
Yes. So how much does EF affect academic performance in college students?
Well, most definitely, not only in college students, but grad school as well. Because if you think about it, it's kind of interesting. In elementary school, things are pretty structured. Get to middle school, it gets a little bit less structured, more responsibility to the student. College, a lot more responsibility to the student, right? They go away to college, the parents aren't around, all that kind of stuff. And then you get to grad school and your professor says, well, now you have to figure out what question you want to answer and how you're going to answer it and make sure you do it well so you get your doctorate. You know, we have this kind of continuum where the higher you go, the more EF is required. And so it's almost like the system isn't really preparing us for that ultimate goal. It's really preparing us more for the intermediate goal or the even beginner goal of do it this way and you'll get the grade that you want. And I can tell you from being a professor for 30 years teaching grad students, when you tell them you have to figure it out, it makes them anxious because we're not used to that. So EF is a critical part, certainly of college and of life. Let's take a few more steps so we stay on track here. I just want to share a few slides about research, and then we'll be done for the day. Starting off with the relationship between EF behaviors, the WISC-IV, EF as measured on the CAS, and achievement. This is a study that we published in our manual, and I'll just step through it here with working from the bottom up. If you look at the bottom here, you see that the CEFI full scale correlates very nicely with achievement. Now, this is not a huge sample, but it's a sizable enough sample. All these students had issues, academic and such. So CEFI is strongly related to achievement. When you look at the WISC and the CEFI, you see it's the WISC-Verbal scale that correlates with achievement. Well, that makes perfect sense to me because the WISC-Verbal scale is just an achievement test because you have information, similarities, arithmetic. That's all knowledge. And I've never agreed that the verbal scale is really verbal intelligence. It's simply a knowledge-based collection of questions, which makes sense why the CEFI would correlate it with it, because it correlates with achievement, and yet the CEFI correlates nicely with the planning part of the CAS. When we look at research on the relationship between executive function and achievement in general, using executive function from the CAS, we see, for a sample of nearly 1,600 children, that we get a very substantial correlation that's consistent across the 5 to 17-year-old range. And really interestingly, in the paper that I published in the Journal of Ed Psych with my colleague Johannes Rohan, when you use a multiple regression and you put in simultaneous and successive processing first, executive function always adds to the prediction of achievement. And you always get your best relationship to achievement, which turns out to be about 0.72, actually, higher than any other instrument that there is. If you take out any one of those, then the prediction to achievement goes down significantly. So this aspect, this piece of the past theory is so very important. Prediction achievement statistically just means better understanding the student. And once we understand the student better, then we can make better decisions about what to do with them, how to help them. Sex differences research is also fascinating with these various instruments. So on the CEFI, what we find are girls are better than boys, as rated by parents, and this is across 3 age groups, very consistent, and by teachers, girls are better than boys. If we're saying that CEFI and CAS and the DESSA all reflect EF, we would expect the same kind of gender differences on all 3 of these different approaches. And that's what we're going to look at next. So we see girls are better than boys on the CEFI. On cognitive assessment system, when we look at the EF portion, girls are better than boys in actual ability, in their actual performance on tasks that get at planning attention. And then when we look at the DESSA, social emotional skills, now this is a T-score here, mean of 50, SD of 10, higher is better. Again, girls are better than boys. So we see this consistent finding across these different instruments because they're really, the foundation is really what we're most concerned about here, and that is this idea of executive function, frontal lobe functioning. So I want to, I just two more slides, and help people think this through in terms of how do you manage this? I'm talking about a multidimensional approach to executive function. What exactly does that mean? That means if there is, I would describe it, a neurocognitive explanation. In other words, an explanation related to the frontal lobes, you should see low ability on an EF scale like the CAS-2, low scores on the behavior rating scale of EF, if low means bad. Some behavior rating scales are configured high means bad, right? So, but conceptually, poor performance on EF as a neurocognitive ability, poor performance on behavior rating scale, poor performance on a social emotional rating, and poor performance on academics, but specific academics, right? Because it's not going to be all academics are not going to be so tied to EF. Only those that really require thinking about how you're doing it, like the math calculation, like the reading comprehension, and so on. If you only have a weakness in the behavior, the social emotional, and academics, let's just say all 3 of those, but the ability part is normal, then I think you have really an environmentally determined situation. I would not call that executive function failure, because I think the key to executive function failure is this neurocognitive weakness related to frontal lobes, because that's what EF is all about. It's about the frontal lobes. And if we're going to be true to that, then we always have to have that evidence. So, assessment of EF should be comprehensive. It should include cognition, behavior, social emotional included in the behavior side, and academic skills. We can encourage students to use EF. It's not direct instruction. It's encouraging instead. And that's really how we can help kids think smarter. And it's a very optimistic perspective, and it's not just for kids. And it's not just for adults, it's for older adults as well.